Okay, welcome everybody. I'm Jeff Gedman with American Purpose. We have a wonderful group for this conversation today. I look at the list, I see we're already 3 or 4 minutes behind, and we have another dozen or so, I trust, joining us in the next couple minutes or so. But let's not delay our guests of honor. Welcome, Eric Edelman and Bill Antholis. We're delighted to have both of you together. That's a prize. Together with us today. You don't need introductions, but you deserve introductions. Eric, of course, is a former senior U.S. government official at the State Department, at the Pentagon, a former U.S. ambassador to Turkey, and a writer, prolific writer with wide range and deep analysis. And so thank you, Eric, for making time. It's great to see you again, as always. And Bill, thank you. You are director of the Merrill Center at the University of Virginia. You are a former State Department official, an American political scientist, a presidential scholar of political history. You've been managing director at the Brookings Institution and other things. You've written about governance, federalism, energy policy, climate change. Good heavens, we are really privileged to have both of you today. And today, we decided to go, well, I'm going to say specific, and let me explain why. I'm going to let Ambassador Edelman and Professor Antholis explain why. We titled today's session, I think, Greece, Turkey, and the Eastern Med. Does the United States have a strategy? And we're going to jump right in. It seems to me, Eric and Bill, that in a moment where foreign policy, like much of our politics, gets fixated and even faddish, I would say, and maybe we lack the global and strategic and balance at times, we're taking one particular area, which in my view gets overlooked or neglected: Greece, Turkey, Eastern Med. I want to start with you, Eric. Why this and why now? These two countries are not at war with one another, thank God. There are players like Russia in the region, but I'm always told, well, good heavens, Jeff Gedman, focus on China. Russia's a declining power. So with all that's on the plate of US foreign policymakers, why this, why now? Eric?
Well, first, Jeff, thank you very much for having Bill and me join you today. I'm glad to be back doing an event with you and Michelle and your entire team at American Purpose. And I, given everything that's going on in the country, I think that having something like American Purpose, where we can have folks on the center right and center left talk to one another without yelling at each other, is actually a huge, important thing. So thank you for that. So my interest, in the Eastern Med, of course, grows out of my having served as U.S. ambassador to Turkey. But in particular, about a decade ago, I began doing some work for the Office of Net Assessment in the Pentagon after very large energy finds were found off the coast of Israel, the Tamar and Leviathan gas fields. And the Leviathan field was, if not the largest, I think it is either the largest or one of the largest gas finds of this century so far. And I was interested in what the potential geopolitical and military consequences could be of that, and began doing some work. And over the last decade, I think the importance of the region, qua region, has increased dramatically because of what's happened nearby. So first, let me start by saying this has always been a historically, strategically important region. Going back to the Greco-Persian Wars, obviously Rome was consumed with security in the Eastern Mediterranean and fought a number of wars itself in the East and built an empire in the East. And it's we should not forget, it's where the Cold War began. It's where President Truman decided to take a stand against Soviet expansionism with the Greek-Turkish aid bill and the Truman Doctrine speech in 1947. And it's in part because this is a place where Europe, Asia, and Africa come together. It's been an important trade route. The Suez Canal in the late 19th century made it vital for Britain's ability to defend its empire. So it's always been an important strategic crossroads. And I think in the last decade, it's become more important because of several different uh, converging or interlaced developments. One has been the strategic shift that Turkey has undergone under the leadership of Recep Tayyip Erdogan. And I'll just briefly talk about it. We can go into more detail later or in Q&A, but it's driven in part by his domestic needs, his growing authoritarianism and personalistic one-man rule. It's tied to some degree to the relationship that he's developed with Putin and with Russia, which can best be perhaps described as competimates, because there's clearly a competitive but also cooperative element to it. A more assertive foreign policy by Turkey generally. I mean, those who know Turkey well know that Ataturk's Turkey was content not to be tied back into the Middle East from which it had emerged out of the wreckage of the Ottoman Empire. But Erdogan has taken a much more assertive role, certainly in Syria, in Idlib province, but also in northeastern Syria after the US evacuation, in Libya, where its intervention has literally changed the balance on the battlefield, and similarly, a year ago or so in Nagorno-Karabakh, where Turkish intervention changed the strategic equation in the North Caucasus as well. And that's opened up some opportunities with Greece, which I'll let Bill talk about, because he and I came together to write, based on his recent travels to Greece, about the opportunities we now have with Greece that have been created by this shift. You mentioned Russia. Both Russia and Iran are very active, obviously, in this region, in Syria, in Libya, Iran through its proxies in Lebanon, has made it clear it sees itself as an Eastern Mediterranean power. And of course, because of the hydrocarbons that I mentioned at the beginning and those discoveries and their exploitation, which Daniel Yergin in his new book, The New Map, about energy and climate change, describes as creating a new sea of contention. Those are Daniel's words. As people think about how those hydrocarbons might be brought to market, and what kind of not only competition they might spur, but how they might spark military conflict. Turkey's been very, very aggressive in pushing its very expansive claims, maritime claims, which are very similar to the kind of claims China has asserted over the South China Sea. Hassan Nasrallah, the head of Hezbollah, has said if there's another conflict between Hezbollah and Israel, one of the first targets is going to be the gas platforms in the Mediterranean. Israel's already begun to try and develop or adapt its David Sling and Iron Dome system to prevent those platforms from being hit by cruise missiles supplied to Hezbollah by Russia and Iran. But there's a very serious undersea threat to that undersea economy, particularly with the low barriers to entry for some pretty sophisticated submersibles that you might see coming into the picture. And then finally, and this is very relevant, I think, to Bill's comments about Greece, because this is a nexus of three continents, it's also always been an artery for mass migration. And in particular, in the last decade, in the wake of the civil wars in Libya and Syria, and now the Taliban takeover in Afghanistan, you're seeing massive flows of people through these areas, many of them headed towards Europe. And that in and of itself has been a destabilizing factor in the politics of the West because of the contribution it's made to the rise of hyper-nationalist populist regimes in East Central Europe and populist movements in Western Europe. So those are the reasons why it's become, I think, more important. To answer the question you posed to us, Jeff, I think one of the problems is the U.S. does not have a strategy, and there's some obstacles to that. Part of the reason we don't have a strategy is we don't think about it as a coherent region. It sits astride some of the divisions of the Unified Command Plan between CENTCOM, EUCOM, and AFRICOM. It also sits astride bureaucratic divides between bureaus in the State Department. And as a result, we have not thought about this region as a whole. Moreover, a lot of the instruments that we built during the Cold War, the Sixth Fleet, military presence in the region, essentially were taken down in the post-Cold War era. And so we lack some of the presence that we used to have in the region. And it's notable that as Turkey has been very aggressively sending warships to disrupt gas prospecting in the area, that it's been France that has carried out freedom of navigation operations rather than the United States Navy, which is a huge change from where we were during the Cold War. So I think this is a very important region. It cries out for a regional approach. There are lots of opportunities for us as well as challenges. I'll let Bill talk about some of that. But because of lack of attention, distraction by other both domestic and foreign policy issues and bureaucratic obstacles, we currently lack a strategy for the region.
Eric, thank you. That's a great start. And we're going to come back to concept, strategy, bureaucratic impediments. I'd like to come back to Russia and Iran too, but in some moments. Bill, could I turn to you? Eric noted early on that in Turkey under Erdogan, there have been shifts, unfortunate ones, domestic, and in international politics and foreign policy. In Greece, there have been shifts too, but of a different nature and character. I want to tell everybody, if you didn't see it, Bill and Eric co-authored a piece in The Bulwark on many of these issues about 3 weeks ago. Check me, I'm not good on dates, but Michelle, if you could find it and post it in chat, that would be enormously helpful. But Bill, talk to us, we're going to come back to regional and big picture, but talk to us a little bit about changes in Greece. And you can talk about threats, but feel free to go right to opportunities. That's what Eric just alluded to.
Sure. Well, first, thanks, Jeff and Michelle, for including me in this. I've so admired your work, and any opportunity to partner with Eric is one that I always seize. And I also want to give a quick shout out to Craig Kennedy as a way of framing this. So it was 20 years ago when 9/11 happened. I was in Brazil on a project that Craig really seeded and encouraged at the German Marshall Fund and really pushed me to do, which was a broad discussion of globalization. And we certainly didn't know that 9/11 was going to happen, but it became all the more relevant. It was a north-south set of dialogues around globalization, global trade, democracy, and development. And so it's really great to be reunited with him. And at the time, I had just left government and joined GMF and got very excited about deepening my own background on Europe. I ran away from Greek issues as a kid because I just wanted to learn more about the rest of the world. And it is funny 20 years later to come back at them. But when my brother and I would often go to Greek American gatherings, we would have a little drinking game where when somebody mentioned Cyprus, we would have to drink and see how inebriated we'd be by the end of the night. And usually the answer was very. But let me say in the last 20 years since 9/11, how much both Greek-Turkey, Greek-American relations, Turkish-American relations, and Greek-Turkish relations have changed. And I don't think that you can, Eric was just part of a 20-year look back we did at the end of last week on 9/11. I don't think you can disassociate them from 9/11. Turkish relations have declined in part because I think it has allowed Erdogan to become even more Islamist to his political benefit. And I think it led to a series of changes in Greece that led the United States and Greece to have an improved relationship. Probably the biggest thing that triggered that was the financial crisis of 2008, 2009. And though we, the United States, did not help out Greece directly financially, even working with a socialist Greek government, which was not our choice and would not have been our choice had we had a say in the matter, the United States had a good working relationship because we, the United States, had an interest in not having Greece fall out of the European Union, particularly because relations with Turkey were souring. And because of that, even with a socialist government in Greece, Greek anti-Americanism, which was a prime feature of Greek politics when I worked for the German Marshall Fund in the early 2000s, has been in steep decline. That is, Greek pro-American feelings have been on the ascent, and that's cut across the political spectrum. So then when 2 years ago, Greece elected a right-of-center government led by someone who has 3 degrees from American universities. Kyriakos Mitsotakis has 2 Harvard degrees and a Stanford degree, worked at Chase Bank and at McKinsey before going back into Greek politics. You suddenly have the opportunity for really strong US-Greek relations. I will say, and I worked in Democratic administrations, I will say, giving the Trump administration, particularly Mike Pompeo, credit, despite Trump's own, let's just say, desire to not provoke Erdogan. And I think that's a diplomatic way of saying that he had a personal relationship with Erdogan that was probably closer than many Americans would have liked. Mike Pompeo did a terrific job, thanks to the stewardship of Jeff Pyatt, the US ambassador to Greece, of really stewarding the Greek relationship, because I think he came to see many of the opportunities that having a strong working relationship with Greece posed, particularly the large military installation at Suda Bay, and the provocations coming from Turkey, which would have gone against American interests on everything from military relations to developing the natural gas opportunities off the coast of Greece and Cyprus. So let's just say that the Biden administration has opportunities to seize on and has been slow to move forward on them because of all the crises I think they're managing, but also maybe because they haven't looked behind the curtain to see what opportunities could be seized. And that's why I think Eric and I wrote the piece that we did. One last thing, which is COVID combined with post-populism is an opportunity to be seized. Greece has been, going back 20 years, pre-9/11, the United States viewed Greece as not just a badly managed country internally, an unstable political partner internally. They had the politics and the administrative feel to the United States of Italy, but smaller and even more dyspeptic. And now you have a right-of-center government with a solid majority, which has managed COVID in a very positive way. I think deaths per million are about 1,300 per million in Greece. In the United States, just so you know, there are about 2,000 per million. Italy is about the same, maybe a little bit larger than in the United States. Germany is about 1,000 per million, and Greece is about 1,300 per million. So it's a well-managed country with respect to COVID for the most part. There's a lot of complexity in why that's the case. And Mitsotakis sees himself as a post-populist Democrat, small d Democrat. He wants to manage with administrative capacity in a consensus-oriented way domestically that communicates effectively to their populace. And I think he is looking to the United States and to present himself as a model in Europe for that kind of governance. When you look to Eastern Europe and you see countries like Poland and Hungary moving in a more populist beyond right of center way. And he wants to present himself as a right of center alternative. And I think he's looking to the United States to seize that opportunity in European politics.
Bill, thank you. I want to come back, before returning to Eric, I want to come back to, there are lots of threads to tug on here. We'll do that in the Q&A in just a few minutes. Everybody bear with me. But Bill, you referenced anti-Americanism and positive trends in Greece. Could you help us understand two things? Greece has been known traditionally to be, quite respectable in anti-Americanism. The roots are political and cultural and have not been shallow. Tell us a little bit more about why these positive developments, and say something, if you would, about how to manage this going forward, both for Greek politicians and elites, but also for American foreign policy, because it is important.
Well, here, in as much as I gave the Trump administration credit, I would give credit here to two things. One is Tsipras, the previous prime minister, who is in the Syriza party, which is the coalition of the radical left. That is quite literally how that party title translates, and which had been the font of anti-Americanism for years, as well as the very far right. Syriza, during the financial crisis, when it came to power, worked very hard to partner with the Obama administration to put pressure on essentially Germany and the Netherlands and the austerity caucus in Europe. The Obama administration put pressure on them to give Greece the best terms possible in working through one bailout after another. And as a result, they stopped being anti-American. And that was enormously helpful to the center-right and what little of a center-left still exists in Greek politics. So that when Mitsotakis got elected 2 years ago, there was no anti-Americanism opposing his right-of-center government as simply a front for the Americans coming in. That's how those parties had always been viewed in the past. And suddenly that critique of those parties was taken away. That's the biggest single cause. I think it also helps, quite frankly, that Turkey being sour, the US-Turkish relationships going sour, means that the radical left and the far right can't point to the United States as being a natural partner of Turkey. The fact that we were in a bad way with Turkey recently takes away another quiver in the anti-American arrow, arrow in the anti-American quiver that Greeks might have.
Bill, thank you. And then we'll be back to you momentarily. Eric, can I ask you if we can return to Russia and Iran? When you were speaking to Secretary of Defense, Secretary of State, and you were describing or defining the respective interests of those two powers in this region, how they conflict or potentially conflict with our interests and what's to be done in advancing our agenda, or let's say containing or countering their agendas. Can you just lay that out for us? What does this picture look like if we talk about Russia, Iran, what they're advancing and what's problematic to American interests?
Well, let me start with Iran. I mean, Iran, of course, has been a disruptive influence in the region, in part because it is, to borrow a phrase that A.J.P. Taylor first applied to Europe in the 19th century, involved in a struggle for mastery in the region, and its allies have been other Shia partners in places like Lebanon and the Arabian Peninsula, including in Yemen and Bahrain, but also Sunni forces like Hamas that are or Palestinian Islamic Jihad that are interested in fighting a continuing war against Israel. So Iran has been a terribly disruptive force in the region. By the way, Yossi Cohen, who just stepped down as the director of Mossad, said a year ago that actually Turkey was even more disruptive than Iran. So what we're seeing is a very complex, struggle for mastery in the region, with a lot of the players having views that are very antithetical to ours. Russia, of course, wants to make itself the arbiter of the region. It's got a military dimension to it that goes to its port and air facilities in Syria, the port of Tartus and the Khmeim Air Base in Syria. It does put one in mind of Wellington's comment about Russia, that they're more interested in securing bases in the Eastern Mediterranean than they are in defeating Napoleon, back in the early 19th century. So the question is, are we going to have a region which, in our view, would be one where we would have good governance, where we would have a fair and equitable arrangement for the energy resources. There's a lot of effort right now, for instance, for Greece, Cyprus, the Republic of Cyprus, and Israel to exploit those hydrocarbon resources, and either using LNG or gas pipelines, exporting them to Europe, which would be a very good alternative to dependence on Russian energy, by the way. But for obvious reasons, Russia would like to make sure that doesn't happen. And Iran, because of its involvement with Hezbollah, is also a disruptive influence, because Lebanon and Israel have unresolved competing claims over some of the undersea resources. So our interest is in a region at peace with itself and able to govern, and not a throughway for, not a generator or throughway for massive waves of migration that'll destabilize European politics. And Iran and Russia have a very different view, and in the case of the Russians, they're quite happy to instrumentalize and weaponize the refugee flows, as they have over the last decade.
So Eric, you got us to European politics. The EU certainly has interest in the region. Does the EU have an Eastern Med strategy?
Sadly, I have to say they don't have a strategy, which is not to say that they, as you say, they clearly have interests and they have a policy. I wouldn't say it's a strategy. The policy essentially has been one of appeasement and trying to buy off, Erdogan, who has managed to sell the same horse 3 or 4 times by, again, threatening to turn on the tap of additional migration. Now, I do want to say that Turkey has borne and is bearing a huge burden of refugees. I think they've got the largest population of Syrian refugees in the world. I think it's well over 3 million at this point. They deserve some assistance. I'm not suggesting that Turkey, bears all of the blame here. But Erdogan has very effectively, as I said, weaponized this against the EU and gotten enormous waves of cash, which have, by the way, helped him manage what is otherwise a much worsening economic situation, a looming debt crisis that I think he worries could torpedo his electoral chances in the next election coming in, I think, 2 years, couple of years.
Thank you, Bill. I have one last question for you before we open it up. It's staying with Europe for a moment. If you're back at the State Department, how do you see Europe as an opportunity to partner with the United States? Or are there areas where you would be advising that we encourage the EU to pursue or act in a particular direction?
Well, it's a great question, and there are two parts of Europe here. One is NATO, and the other is the EU. I'll start with the EU because it's not just Greece, but it's also Cyprus and Turkey's complicated relationship with the EU, particularly on trade and economic issues. As Eric was saying, the refugees issues are enormous here, and particularly for Greece. I mean, one way to think about Turkey is essentially Mexico. Many of the migrants showing up in Matamoros, Mexico, coming across to Brownsville, Texas, most are not from Mexico. Most are from Central America. And that's kind of what Turkey is dealing with right now. And when Eric says that Turkey is weaponizing them, they're releasing them mostly to Greek shores and to the shores of Greek islands, which at first were very welcoming and now have become somewhere between problematic and hostile. So that's potentially a flashpoint, and Europe has to be involved because whether or not Texas would have the wherewithal to deal with migrants, it is an American problem. And as we've seen, the Biden administration has struggled to manage it much in the same way. The Europeans are going to have to help the Greeks on this point. And then beyond that, the natural gas challenges are Greece, Cyprus, Israel, which means the EU needs to be involved. And France has, in particular, stepped up and tried to take the lead there, as they should. And the United States will want the Europeans to help manage these problems. They will not want this. We at the State Department will not want this to be seen as a bilateral problem between the United States and Turkey, or a trilateral problem, US, Turkey, Greece. We will want the Europeans to step forward and manage it. And yet on the security side, the Suda base station is not an American base, it's a NATO base. And we, the United States, will want NATO to step forward, particularly because we're dealing with another NATO ally in Turkey, the least reliable NATO ally that we have, and increasingly on the outs in NATO, but still part of NATO. And so I do think that the United States is going to want to multilateralize this, and yet a show of US interest, direct and bilateral, to Greece and Cyprus would be really welcome, because it would send a signal to the EU and to NATO that the United States is not just relying on the bureaucracy, but on the politics of those two organizations.
Bill,
Jeff,
thank you.
Jeff, can I just add
yes, sir,
one
please,
thing?
please.
Yeah, just to add one thing to what Bill said. I honestly believe that an American role is essential here, in part because the Europeans are so riven by different interests here. Some have an energy interest, some have a migration interest. And the likelihood that they can come up with a policy on their own, I think, is vanishingly small. And so, as has frequently been the case in these kinds of things, we have to provide a framework. But as Bill was saying, I think we're going to want the Europeans to, be up front and take the lead. Although I was glad to see the French step up, and particularly, as Bill was saying, and particularly in the area of freedom of navigation. But I think the global commons is so important to U.S. strategy globally that not having the U.S. With a naval presence in the Eastern Med is a problem. And I think we do have to address that.
Thank you, Eric. So you all, my screen is off because I'm having a problem with my picture. I'm here. I'm not inattentive. I'm very focused. Okay. I also made a mistake earlier. I said that your piece 3 weeks ago, or in July, maybe, that was published in the Bulwark. We love the Bulwark, but we love the Dispatch too. And it was the Dispatch that published it. That's in chat. Thank you, Michelle, very much for posting that in chat. Floor is open. We have 20 minutes for questions, answers, and comments, and we have an outstanding group. If you raise your hand or press the raised hand function, I'm happy to call on you. Yulia, tell us who you are, and then you have the floor.
Thank you, Jeff, and thank you for the overview, Ambassador Edelman and Professor Antholis. My name is Yulia George. I'm from Romania. I teach at Georgetown, European Security, and I work at the Middle East Institute, particularly on the Black Sea. And so that's how I got into the Eastern Med in the first place. I have one kind of a broader question, and I'd be curious to see how you see all of these elements that we've seen over the last few years in this larger region of the Eastern Med in the future in this Biden administration. What I've seen on the ground over the last few years, particularly in the Trump administration, though one can argue it wasn't as strategic as it should have been, is I have seen the United States relatively stepping up, particularly when it comes to energy with the LNG terminal in Alexandroupolis, which is really, even though a small element, a game changer in terms of offering alternatives, just as in the Baltic Sea, to Russian gas, even though it's more expensive. It's a game changer. And then you alluded several times to a possible pipeline even from Israel all the way into this region. And I've also seen the United States stepping up through the 3 Cs initiative, which here is kind of focused on counter or balancing out China in the region, and with Greece particularly for the first time participating in a 3C summit this year as an observer, but with the opportunity of or the option of increasing its status membership within that. And with the Pompeo administration initially pledging up to 1 billion, that makes a real difference to the region. So with all of that in mind, my question to both of you would be, how do you see, or are there early signs for the Biden administration as prioritizing this region? And if so, how would that look like compared to the previous administration in terms of concrete actions? What can we expect from the Biden administration really concretely in the Eastern Med, whether it's about countering or balancing China and or Russia, or in the energy field? Thank you.
Bill, you want to take that first?
Sure. I guess I'd put it this way. It's a great question that they haven't answered yet. I think even stepping back from President Biden himself, Tony Blinken, Jake Sullivan, they know the region quite well and they know the players quite well. But I think they're overwhelmed right now with their inbox. They don't yet have confirmed officials below Toria Nuland. I know Toria knows the region well, and I would say that Toria's strong working relationship with Jeff Pyatt is the closest thing that we have to a strategy, and it's a very close relationship. The Greek ambassador, U.S. ambassador to Greece, as you probably know, was ambassador to Ukraine, particularly in 2014 when the Crimea crisis and the Maidan all happened. And that is probably, with respect to an engaged, constructive focus on the region, the best that can be said for the administration. Moving forward, Biden in the Greek American community is known as Bidenopolis. He's raised a huge amount of money from Greek Americans. And I suspect that when he finally pays attention to it, that will make some small difference. He has made clear his own questions about Erdogan, and he has he has other broader knowledge of the region just from his many years of service. But I think he's still dealing with the huge inbox that he has, and he just hasn't focused yet. But Eric, I'd love to hear if you think differently on this.
No, I was going to say many of the same things you did, Bill. I think A, they're overwhelmed. B, they're understaffed. That makes it hard to focus on something that's not really right at the top of the agenda. And this is, well, I think you and I are making the argument for why this is important. It's clearly not something that has an immediacy that would get their attention. I did want to, though, touch on one thing that Julia raised in her question that I think is important, because it goes back to something Jeff said at the outset. With all of the attention he said on China and East Asia, why should we care about this region? And Julia's comment, I think, is important. I mean, the Belt and Road Initiative clearly has aspirations to, penetrate through Central Asia into Europe, a network of infrastructure and relationships that will be favorable to China in a global competition with the West. And I mean, you can see this in the Chinese acquisitions of operating the port of Piraeus, for instance, in Athens. So there is an important, we focused in our comments on Iran and Russia for, I think, good and obvious reasons. They are the most active here. But there's a Chinese dimension to this as well, and there's a strategic competition dimension with China that should not be ignored here. It's another important reason why we need to pay attention to the region and provide some leadership.
Yeah, I would absolutely echo that, and I have mentioned that a couple times in one press interview or another that I've done in Greece. And the Greeks are super sensitive about this because they signed the deal with China in the port of Piraeus in the middle of the financial crisis when Europe didn't bail them out. And they signed it under the Tsipras, under the socialist government. I think that the Mitsotakis government doesn't want to go back on a signed agreement, particularly because they don't have the resources to buy out the Chinese interests. I think they'd love to figure out a way to get around it. And it has posed real problems in US-Greek bilateral relations before, because Tsipras, after having signed that agreement, then voted in the EU against sanction or against acting against the Chinese in the UN Human Rights Commission, blocking the Chinese on the Human Rights Commission. And the US, I don't think, will tolerate that well, particularly if the Biden administration wants to embrace a pro-democracy approach to the world and a democracy summit and all of that. So I would pay attention, careful attention to that. It is the one thorn in the side of US-Greek relations right now.
So thank you both. I'm going to follow on and then invite people to raise your hand when you're ready. So Bill and Eric, overwhelmed, understaffed, and here we are. It is mid-September, and Thanksgiving and Christmas are coming, and time flies, and there'll be a next crisis after the Afghanistan crisis. So advice to USG that is realistic and achievable, because it seems to me we find ourselves in a bind. You've spelled out the problems, and you said Bill, Toria Nuland and her relationship to a U.S. diplomat is the closest thing we have to a strategy. We need to have a vision and strategy for key regions in the world. We can't not do that. We are supposed to be a superpower of some kind. And so here we are, from theory to practice. Realistically, how do you advise the Secretary of Defense, Secretary of State, Jake Sullivan, to get something on track the next 6 to 12 to 18 months in the context of those realities? Eric, you first.
Well, I mean, this is, the last refuge of scoundrels that I'm going to go to, but When we find ourselves facing bureaucratic obstacles to foreign policy making, our typical workaround is, a special envoy. And then every administration comes in and says, I want to get rid of all these special envoys. And then they go appoint a whole bunch of special envoys. So I actually think in this instance, because you've got this, kind of both State Department, Defense Department, divisions that make it difficult to integrate a strategy for a region like this, I do think an envoy for the Eastern Med would be advisable. And there would be no shortage of things for that person to do. I mean, they could take on moving the Libyan peace process between Haftar and the GNA forward. Certainly the energy dimensions, Yulia was adverting to the Trump administration support. Really, as Bill said, it was really Secretary Pompeo whose support for the Eastern Med Gas Forum was essential in getting that kicked off. But you can't count on the Secretary of State doing that all the time. So I do think that would be one helpful step. And the other, I think, that's pretty easy to do is to step up the U.S.-Greek bilateral military-to-military cooperation. First of all, there's, I think, a big appetite for it in Greece. Secondly, I think it provides you with a bit of leverage on the Turks, and I say that advisedly because I, as ambassador to Turkey, when I was trying to get a decision out of the Turkish government about the use of Incirlik Air Base to transload and transship cargo into Iraq and Afghanistan as a cargo hub back in 2005. I'd literally been negotiating with them for a year and couldn't get a decision, and was about to leave to return to the United States to a different job. And I essentially let the press know that, if we couldn't do this in Incirlik, we would go to Akrotiri and do it in Cyprus. And within 24 hours, the government called me in and said, okay, let's sign this deal on, the Incirlik cargo hub. So I do think we need to have a little bit of leverage with the Turks. I think that will help a bit, and it's something that would strengthen our hand and bring back some U.S. military assets to the region, which has been denuded of them, and therefore leaves us without that instrument. I mean, there are other instruments we need to use as well. I'm not suggesting this is purely a military problem, but not having many military instruments in the region is actually really a debility that, to our having a strategy or policy.
Eric, thank you. Bill, we've just heard Eric say deepen the U.S.-Greek bilateral relationship and defense cooperation. Can you build that out a little bit? If you're advising the administration, which I suspect you are, and there are opportunities, you and Eric have written about that in the dispatch. What does a robust U.S.-Greek bilateral relationship look like right now? Think about defense, think about economics, commercial affairs, think about energy. Could you spell that out for us a little bit?
Sure. Let me start with the personal politics. Greeks are very driven by personalities and celebrity status. Mitsotakis will make a visit for the UN in the fall. They would love to have a full-on state visit. If it ends up just being a working visit, that would be fine as well. This is their 200th anniversary of Greek independence, or of the original war for independence from the Ottoman Empire. So some basic personal love would go a long way, because they think that would send a signal. I think it needs to go beyond that. So I think the big opportunities are in, I think finding a coordinator in the Eastern Med to take it a little bit out of Greece, but to expand it to Cyprus and Israel, I think would be very helpful in that regard. It would bring in the security dimensions and tie them to the economic dimensions. But then drilling down on the Greek-specific issues, Greece would like to set itself apart from some of those other countries for all kinds of reasons. Um, Greece is having a real boom in the tech sector. They kind of view themselves as an opportunity to bring home the Greek diaspora, particularly since people, work from Greece is becoming a hashtag in post-COVID, because you can have a nice life there and still work from wherever you are. And the Greek diaspora, particularly in the UK with Brexit, they're really trying to lure some of those folks back to Greece. And there are things the United States could do there as well if they wanted to get involved. So there's an additional dimension to U.S.-Greek economic relations that the U.S. could point to outside of the regional ones.
Bill, thank you. Erica, I'm going to end up here with you, if I may, expanding just a bit. We just heard from Bill about Greece, and I think you called it personal love. And of course, as we manage bilateral relationships and as we manage our alliances, gestures are important. We just came through a fraught and bloody exit from Afghanistan. We've had a lot of criticism from allies about how we consulted and how we managed that situation. Eric, could you tell us a little bit about this moment going forward in the region and within NATO, how we want to manage our relationships, and are there short-term things that can be done that can be under the rubric gestures that will help lighten some of the alliance stress?
You're muted.
You're muted, Eric. Take yourself off mute, please.
Sorry about that. Yeah, I think one of the biggest casualties, Jeff, of the whole mismanagement of the Afghanistan exit has been the alliance piece of it, in part because there really was not even much of a pretense of consultation with the allies, who were very fixated on in together, out together, and who were very dependent on us for egress, as was demonstrated during the last frantic 2 weeks of August. The only thing that I think really works is actually, there's now a lot of cynicism, I think, in Europe about the Biden administration and its protestations that America is back and it wants to work with allies and it supports democracy and human rights. I think there's a very high degree of cynicism. And I think the only antidote to that is, and this is where staffing is really important, is to have very deep, by which I mean not just Secretary of State visits to NATO and EU, but very deep consultation across all levels of government with our European allies and other partners in Europe, like Finland and Sweden, where it's not just informing them about what U.S. policy is going to be, but actually really sitting down. This would be one very good place to do it and say, look, here's how we think about the problem. How do you think about the problem? How can we come together to some kind of common approach? Is very much, I think, necessary in Turkey. It's for U.S. bilateral Turkish relations. It's very important not to be operating at cross purposes with Europe, as we have all too often been. And so I think it's going to require that level of institutionalized, genuine consultations, as opposed to informing them of some policy decision we've made, which we then claim was a consultation. We've gotten out of the habit of doing that over the years, frankly, across a number of administrations, not just the Trump administration. But the Trump administration, more than any other, personalized these relationships at a very high level, either the presidential or cabinet level, and deinstitutionalized them. I mean, it was particularly acute, for instance, in relations with Israel, with Saudi Arabia, with a couple of other, and Turkey, certainly, where the relationship was, run between Erdogan and the Trump family, or between the House of Saud and the Trump family. And we really have to reinstitutionalize all of those relationships, including our transatlantic relationships with the EU and NATO and our bilateral partners. And that means you have to get these, it can't just be even the sub-cabinet level. I mean, it can't just be Toria Nuland doing this, it's who's a former ambassador to NATO and, obviously knows kind of the score and how to do these things. But you have to have the assistant secretaries in place, as Bill was saying. And you have to do this, as George Shultz, my former boss, said, it's, gardening. It needs constant tending. And that's, I think, the antidote for what has been created by this somewhat shambolic withdrawal.
Eric, thank you. That's going to be the penultimate word. I'm going to apologize to Fritz Heinzen and others who are waiting. My fault in not bringing you in time. Bill, I'm going to offer you 60 seconds for a final comment or observation with which we can go forward.
Yeah, I guess the one final thing that I'd say is there is no Greek government that I know of, no responsible, credible, likely Greek government that I know of that wants to have bad relations with Turkey. And we're now in a position where the major parties in Greece want to have good relations with the United States. That sets up a huge number of opportunities. And the question is, will the United States see that and use Greece to forge better relations with Turkey as opposed to provoking Turkey? Now, obviously, it takes two to tango with Turkey, and Erdogan's election coming up in the next 2 years is the biggest wild card out there. Will it provoke him to do something in advance? Will it just return him to power? That doesn't look to be the case right now. And what comes after Erdogan? And are we prepared for that in whatever direction that is? So that's the other thing that I'd be watching for is what kind of Turkey are we going to be looking at in the next 2 years and beyond?
Yes, Eric, did you want to?
Well, Jeff, because I saw Fritz's question in the chat, I'm happy to try and give a very quick answer.
Go ahead, be brief because we're over time, but please do.
Yeah, so the question was whether there are elements in Turkey that in the business community or elsewhere that are, more amenable to EU accession, and the answer is yes, of course. There are lots of elements of the Turkish business community that would love to see stronger Turkish EU ties, but there are two things that I think you have to bear in mind. One is they're incredibly cowed by Erdogan, and so they don't want to do or say anything that will get them into trouble with the Turkish president and the Turkish state as a result. And moreover, I would not say that the European Union has managed the accession process brilliantly. I mean, there have been a number of mistakes along the way that have convinced a lot of Turks that the EU has no interest in Turkey ever really becoming a member of the EU. And so there's been a big souring in Turkey across the board in popular opinion on the whole question of EU accession. I would love to hear more European leaders quoting Erdogan back to himself, which is back when I was ambassador, no causal relationship, but Erdogan used to say that the Copenhagen criteria for EU accession should be renamed the Ankara criteria because those are things that Turkey should want to do for its own sake to make it a modern, functioning, democratic society. And that was right. And I think Europeans ought to quote him to himself and try and get Turks back on a path towards accession. It's one of the few things that I can think could prevent the country from going in very bad directions.
So Eric and Bill and Fritz and all of you, thank you very much. It makes me think, Eric and Bill, if you were willing, that we'll let the Germans have their elections, I think on September 26th, let them sort out a new government. I think we would love to have you back this fall or maybe winter with a European conversation partner, perhaps someone from that new German government. It'll take a little bit of time because I think this has been a pleasure and a privilege. It's been stimulating and challenging. And I don't think we can let this is not our bread and butter at American Purpose, but I don't think we can let this go from our perspective as a one-off. So would love to twist your arm and bring you back. I hope soon. To everybody who made time, thank you so much. And Bill and Eric, really beautifully done. We're grateful.
Thank you, Jeff. It was a pleasure.
My thanks too, and really great to see you all. And Craig, great to see you again. We need to catch up.
And Jeff, you don't have to twist too hard to get Bill and me to talk about, the Eastern Mediterranean.
Noted. I'm on the case. Thank you, Eric. Thanks, Bill. Thanks, everybody. Have a good
Take care.
afternoon. Good evening. Bye now.
Thanks so much.